Happy Tuesday, everyone. How are you guys doing? I see we have a few people with us. Marion Lowry, happy Tuesday. That's what you say too. Anna Mae Foley from Fitchburg, Massachusetts. Aha, so you already have a question for Dr. Carrillo. I have depression, and can it cause dementia or Alzheimer's? We're going to definitely get to that today because we're going to talk about some of the risk factors. Stay with us, but the answer is that yes, it is one of the risk factors. Hi, Donna Lynn from South Jersey, a very hot South Jersey. Yeah, it is going to be really a hot one here in the Northeast. Hi, Tammy Lewis. Beautiful Tuesday. Jeanette Persons from Lisbon, North Dakota. We've got a really good one today. You're going to learn a lot today. This is an important program today, and we might even go a little long. So grab a glass of water or something and sit down. You're going to want to hear all this information. Cindy Abood, happy Tuesday. Rebecca Franick, hi Joan. Cricket, how you doing from Bluebell, Pennsylvania? And Cindy from up in Maine. We're going to be going there. We're making our annual trek this weekend. Gail Weezy's, hi. Marty Collum, it's so nice to have you with us again today from Pennsylvania. Leslie saying hello today. Leslie Wensley from hot Michigan is hot there too. Deborah Keys from Texas, and of course also from Camp Reveille. Linda Temple, you work at a place for mom up in Portland, Oregon, not Portland, Maine. Gosh, we have a lot of people with us. Hi, Christy Getch from Battleground, Washington. Joan Lunden, my namesake. Hi. Linda Robert from Canada joining us today. And I'll get to more of you as we go on. But, we've talked a little bit about the fact that June, and today is Tuesday, June 9th. And I've mentioned that this is National Alzheimer's and Brain Health Month. I really think that of all the different aging issues that we experience, and I guess that's as good a time as any for my shameless book plug of the day. Why did I come into this room? This right here. And that's why I used it in the title. I mean, we can have leaky bladders and expanding waistlines and loss of libido, But I think that forgetfulness, I really think that is probably the scariest one of all. Don't you think? The most worrisome? I mean, I think most people I talk to says that's the thing that scares them the most. And the numbers are scary as well. The number of Americans living with Alzheimer's is growing, and it's growing fast. An estimated 5.8 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's today. About 80% of them are 75 or older. But listen to this. By 2050, remember, this is 2020. It all snuck up on us. By 2050, that number is projected to rise to nearly 14 million. And I think what I want to stress today is Alzheimer is not just about memory loss. Alzheimer's kills. It is the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S. And we have an incredible guest today to speak to these numbers and talk to us about brain health, to talk to us about the risks and what we can do to try to stave off this disease. She is the chief scientist for the National Alzheimer's Association Global Research Program, Dr. Maria Carrillo. Doctor, I welcome you today. Hi, it is so fabulous to have you joining us today.
Honor to be with you, Joan. Thank you so much.
These are frightening numbers. I mean, 1 in 3 seniors dies with Alzheimer's or another dementia. It kills more than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. I want to ask you, if I may, just a really basic question, but I know it's the question a lot of people have. What's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
Well, that's a great question. It is, I think, the most fundamental question we do receive. And there is a significant difference. I think the best way to categorize it in lay terms is if you think of dementia, it's an umbrella term and can encapsulate many different types of dementias. And Alzheimer's is the most common type. So it's like saying cancer, but then you have to drill down and say what cancer, especially when you think about wanting to treat the specific cancer. Well, the same thing is for dementia, lots of different types of dementia, and Alzheimer's being the most common. And it's important to understand which dementia your loved one might be experiencing, because treatment options, even though they are more limited, certainly than cancer, unfortunately, but they can be different.
Before we get into warning signs and things, and what's the difference between dementia and normal aging? Because people start forgetting things, they're searching for a word. They do come into a room and say, why did I come into this room? And they worry, uh-oh, this is the beginning of dementia. That's not necessarily the case, right?
That's correct. It's not necessarily the case. And we do know that dementia is not normal aging. And that's the important thing to understand. And that underlying dementia, no matter what type, are serious brain changes that are associated with the disease, whether it's Alzheimer's disease, whether it's vascular dementia caused by vascular disease, or frontal temporal, Lewy body dementia. There's so many different types. So it is not normal aging. And you and I both know a lot of people who are now in their 90s and even older that are sharp as a tack. And we all want to be able to retire and enjoy those golden years. And we want them to be golden, right? We don't want them to be impacted by Alzheimer's or another dementia.
Before we get into that, the early signs, the risk, how we can stave it off, in trying to understand the numbers just a little bit, I mean, it seems as though the statistics are growing worse. Between 2000 and 2018, while deaths from other major causes decreased significantly, like heart disease, it went down almost 8%. Alzheimer's increased 146%. Now, is that just due to a numbers thing, because we have this shift in our population to an older population, so there are more older people, or is it because we're all just eating so bad and not exercising? What is it from, do you think?
Well, those are really sobering statistics for us all as we age. But I have to say that it is a combination of things, right? So first of all, we are living to be older. The average age, even 20 years ago, was probably 5 to 10 years less than today. The average lifespan today, it's like 83 for men and I think 84.5 for women, and that changes year by year depending on statistics. But we're living longer, there's no doubt. And so we're living longer to unfortunately be affected by Alzheimer's, because we have been very good in terms of research dollars and medical advances that have allowed us to switch out a hip and fix a knee, do all kinds of things from the neck down. And we have not funded sufficiently, until more recently, the brain and how we can examine what's happening in the brain as we age, and hopefully then stop some of these diseases from killing our older population.
Well, I think as the population shifts, there's going to be a whole lot more people who are going to want to protect their brain and retain their cognitive thinking. When you kind of drill down in those numbers, I had a couple of questions. It looked like 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women. Why do we know why that is?
So, that statistic is really important, and that statistic has been around for quite some time. At first, we, really, I've been at the Alzheimer's Association 15 years now, and for the first 7 years or so, we all, and the scientific community, all thought that it was because women live longer, and there are more women than men, and therefore, more women are probably living with Alzheimer's than men, because they probably die earlier, younger, of something else, even if they have Alzheimer's. But today, we actually understand that that's not the case. We ourselves, 7 years ago, had a think tank with the National Institute of Aging and other experts to come together and ask the question, why women were more vulnerable, why 2/3 of Americans living with Alzheimer's are women. What we discovered is that there is a lot of fabulous research out there that leads to potential genetic risks, to potential risks linked to estrogen and menopause, and other brain changes that are just different between men and women. And so we've launched a women's Alzheimer's research fund, and we have funded about 17 projects to date to try to explore what the underlying reasons are and try to see if we could actually address some of these differences. And remember, everything we learn about women will be applicable to learning more about how men are impacted too. So that's what we're trying to still figure out. But there is an increased risk, and we're trying to figure out why.
It's about time I did a medical research on women and let men go ahead. Sorry. I also noticed in those numbers, though, that African Americans are about twice as likely to have Alzheimer's as older whites, and Hispanics about 1.5 times. Again, do we understand why?
Yeah, we have some good information about that. And it's, I think, typical as we're seeing now with the COVID-19 situation, there are underrepresented populations and health disparities certainly at play. And so that is important to think about. But in particular, research also tells us, and epidemiology tells us, that African Americans have an increased risk of heart disease, in particular, high blood pressure. And that the Latinx population in the United States has a higher risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And both of these, including other cardiovascular risk factors, are risk factors for dementia, in particular Alzheimer's dementia as well. And so we think that that's what's the leading edge of why these underrepresented populations have an increased risk.
Well, it's interesting when you think about hereditary. Here's Marty Cullum saying, my mom lived to be 96, had no memory problems. But her sister had Alzheimer's, which started in her 70s and was a devastating disease. So is there a hereditary risk factor?
So there is a hereditary component, there is no doubt. And we know that if you have a first-degree relative with Alzheimer's, you are at an increased risk. So we don't even really need genetic testing to tell you that. And so, I mean, for example, my husband's mother passed away 3 years ago of Alzheimer's dementia. And we know that that increases the risk for my husband and his 2 siblings. But we also know that there are currently about 38 risk genes that have been discovered. They confer smaller risks in the single percentages. There is one risk gene that confers anywhere between a 25 and a 75% increased risk, depending on if you've inherited 1 copy or 2 copies, right? 1 copy from either mom or dad, and then 2 copies, both your mom and dad had it, and you inherited it. And so this gene is called ApoE4. I think it is familiar to many individuals, and that does tend to increase risk. These risk genes do not guarantee that a person will get Alzheimer's dementia, but they are at an increased risk. And so all of us should be really working under the assumption that we're at increased risk because we're aging. And certainly those of us who have a family member, like a parent, should also be even more vigilant.
So here's Leslie Wheeler Wensley. Are the beginning symptoms of Alzheimer's just the memory change, or can it be personality change as well?
What a fabulous question. About 5 years ago, we started working on trying to understand whether neuropsychiatric symptoms could also be portenders or early symptoms of Alzheimer's dementia. And we published a paper that actually said that, yes, they could be, and that they should be on the radar of physicians, because personality changes can absolutely be portenders of an oncoming dementia or memory loss. And that is because the brain is changing, and some of the parts of the brain cells can be affected by these proteins. And depending on which part that is, they could have an impact on personality, on memory, on apathy, depression, aggressivity, perhaps, all kinds of different sequelae that can come from those brain changes.
So if you have a loved one, or maybe it's you, just kind of lay out for this in a simple thing, the early signs that you might be dealing with.
Sure.
Alzheimer's, not just dementia, but Alzheimer's.
You know, it's a very unique situation, Alzheimer's dementia. And it's not until perhaps you have a clinician that helps you understand those symptoms that you really understand it. But I can tell you that in my own family, my own personal experience, my mother-in-law has passed away of Alzheimer's dementia. My father-in-law passed away a year later of vascular dementia. And I can tell you that they were very different in their trajectories. Alzheimer's being very specific to a very early short-term memory loss that can have symptoms like forgetting why you walked into a room, as you have said earlier. But the very big difference is that when you retrace your steps, usually it comes back to you, right? Yeah. And with Alzheimer's, you can't retrace your steps. You can't remember. Even going back, you just lose that thought. And over time, it becomes worse and enough to interfere with your daily life. And that's when it should become worrisome. And you yourself, or if you see this in a loved one, should raise this with your physician. And actually, more importantly, with a clinician that is an expert in diagnosing dementia.
Yeah, that was where I was going next, is what's the proper way to go about getting a diagnosis? Because this is nothing to fool around with.
Right? There's a lot of this information on not only the early signs, what's okay and what's healthy, worried well, right? On our website on alz.org. It also talks about how to get a diagnosis. And I'm sorry to say that our research, we definitely have cancer envy. There's a lot of great research in cancer that has led us to early detection. And we're working on that. But we're not yet to the point where a blood test in your PCP's office can give you that diagnosis. It's unfortunate. So we really do need experts, neurologists, psychiatrists, geriatricians who just see older people, a lot of them, to help a person navigate through whether something is, just older age and you're stressed or you may not be sleeping well, or if it is something of a concern, because it will take maybe a few months to get that accurate diagnosis if you're with the right physician. If not, it could take you up to 2 years. And so it's important to get to a specialist. They have to also do an MRI, which can give you pictures of the brain and tell you if there's something else going on that's perhaps like a stroke or something else that's very different from Alzheimer's. And if there's not, then it's more than likely that it is a dementia related, and perhaps Alzheimer's, since it is the most common type of dementia.
We have Deborah Keys asking, do head injuries, concussions, increase the risk of dementia?
Well, that's also a great question. And in the last 10 years, we've had some different reports on whether traumatic brain injuries, concussions are increasing your risk of Alzheimer's in particular. And the latest research that we understand is that traumatic brain injuries and concussions, and we learned this from NFL players, and you've seen a lot of reports about that, and from also veterans, right, that have concussions from war injuries, that in fact, there is an increased risk of dementia, of memory loss, but that it is not related to Alzheimer's dementia directly. It has similar proteins that change, but they're not the same. So there is an increased risk for dementia with a traumatic brain injury, but it is not of the type of Alzheimer's.
But with those concussions and brain injuries, while Alzheimer's not maybe, in the future, other kinds of dementia are likely? I mean, is it those risk factors?
I would say they increase your risk. We can't really say likely. And because it just depends on the type of concussion, it depends on the amount of minutes, for example, that a person has experienced memory loss, and it depends on if it was repeated concussions, because that seems to be the key, that it has to be repeated head injuries, or perhaps one large traumatic brain injury with a sustained loss of consciousness. And so it really does depend, but I will tell you that the increased protein that we see associated with concussions is tau proteins, and tau neurofibrillary tangles, tau tangles, is one of the proteins that is also a hallmark of Alzheimer's. So there is a relationship there, but it's not exactly the same.
We have Patty Barber asking, can lots of dental work affect the brain and then lead to Alzheimer's?
Well, that's a question we get quite a bit, actually. So someone's been reading up, so that's great. But as far as we know today, fillings and dental work are not related to an increase in Alzheimer's. So that was thought to be the case, perhaps because of metal implants and other things. But today we understand that that is not the case.
All right, we have a few more coming in here. Karen Fiore, does chemo cause memory impairment that can become evident years later?
So another good question. And in fact, because cancer in particular and Alzheimer's have an inverse relationship, we wanted to understand that. And what do I mean by an inverse relationship? It seems that certain cancers are actually protective of Alzheimer's dementia. That's a very strange thing to think about. And so we wanted to understand why that was. And we didn't know if it was related to just having had that type of genetic makeup that puts you at a predisposition for cancer, but not for Alzheimer's, or if perhaps it was the treatments that is associated, because we all hear about chemo brain, right? And that after you have chemotherapy, you have some memory loss. And most of the time, though, that memory loss is regained, because it does seem that overall, statistically, people that have cancer and go through therapies are actually protected from Alzheimer's. So it's a very interesting thing. And I think we just need more science about that. And we've had a think tank and actually funded some studies to try to understand that relationship.
Sandy Stockdale is asking, is there any link between diet soda and memory loss?
That's another good question that we get quite a bit. And there is no link between diet soda and memory loss. Okay. I think more importantly, diabetes is an increased risk factor. So one must be very careful with our sugar intake. So that doesn't mean that diet sodas are great, because water is really probably the best thing for us to drink. But it's important to know that diet soda, we do not have any evidence that diet soda has a relationship with Alzheimer's dementia.
So we've talked, and several people have asked now about depression, and whether depression can be a risk factor for Alzheimer's or dementia.
And dementia has a link with depression, there is no doubt. That is also one of those symptoms that I talked about earlier with your earlier question that was posed about neuropsychiatric or other types of symptoms being portenders of dementia or being early signs. And so depression is, I think, one of those. We have a lot of research that tells us that people with depression are at an increased risk of Alzheimer's dementia. And so the question, though, becomes, which came first? Is a person's depression a result of brain changes that are associated with early signs of Alzheimer's dementia? Or is the depression actually causing a person to withdraw from their loved ones, to not have as many conversations, not go out, and then start to be more vulnerable to Alzheimer's depression, to memory decline, because they're not as active? So there's a lot to unpack here, and we are hosting a lot of conferences and actually research on this, because it's so important, because depression is so prevalent in our country.
Yeah, and that's what I think that's what I was trying to understand here. If the person has like a history of long-term depression all their life, or are we talking about those little changes that we were saying that all of a sudden,
right,
70 or 75 or 80, they all of a sudden get depressed? And is that like the portender? Right. Is there a difference between those two? Is that a fair question?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, because that's actually what we're trying to find out. Mm-hmm. I can tell you right now that the treatment of depression is really important. So that if your loved one or you yourself are suffering from depression, it's important to get treatment. And we don't know if that treatment will help with the reduction of risk of Alzheimer's in the future, but it's important. The other thing I will tell you that is really important is that there are a few clinical trials out there with antidepressants as a potential treatment for Alzheimer's dementia. Wow. So there is a link there that is related to the underlying chemicals and biology in the brain, that it causes this strong link between Alzheimer's and dementia. So it is important that if you do suffer from depression, please get treatment. Yeah. And there is more information at alz.org about all of this.
And that leads me, are there, good, reliable medications that are being used now for people that are suffering from Alzheimer's and or dementia? And are there breakthroughs that are on the horizon?
Well, we certainly are very hopeful for new treatments, but I can start by sharing with you that there are some FDA-approved treatments for Alzheimer's dementia specifically. And so there are 4. They're very common. My mother-in-law was actually using 2 of them in combination. And the important thing here is that the earliest possible that your loved one can have access to these treatments, the better the outcome for the person, because they treat symptoms. They don't treat the underlying cause, but the longer you can treat the symptoms, the longer you can keep those memory problems sort of manageable, right, for your loved one. And that's so important when you do have that diagnosis in your family. And so I would just say the early diagnosis is critical, and having access to those medications is important. But we are on the hunt for better treatments. because we know we need to stop those biological changes that are happening in the brain. And the key is to stop them, of course, before a person has a full-fledged diagnosis of dementia, maybe even during the earlier stage, which is called mild cognitive impairment, where it's a precursor to dementia. Can we stop the disease there if we stop these brain changes? Joan, it's kind of like how we think today of cardiovascular disease. When we say you have high cholesterol and you have cardiovascular disease, and if we don't change your trajectory now of that cholesterol level, you will probably have a high risk of having a heart attack. And with medication, with potentially some changes in your diet, with some exercise maybe, you can actually make those changes. We hope that we can show that same thing for Alzheimer's. If we can detect these blood proteins or brain proteins early, and we can give a medication that can change that trajectory, could we slow or even stop, if given early enough, the trajectory of Alzheimer's dementia? And that's what's being on the hunt today for. And we know that there is one potential treatment that has been submitted to the FDA by a company called Biogen that may very well do this. That may be, if approved, the first treatment to treat the underlying causes of Alzheimer's dementia, not just the symptoms. And we're hopeful that that determination by the FDA might come maybe by the end of this calendar year.
Wow,
That's exciting.
Great. Well, it's kind of like with breast cancer. I mean, the earlier you detect it, the better prognosis you'll probably have. A couple of people are asking. One asked about fluoride, and this one, Marty Coleman is asking. For years ago, aluminum pots and pans were a concern for causing Alzheimer's. Is it still a concern?
Both of those are great questions. We do have a section on our website at alz.org that talks about those things, but I can just share with you very quickly that aluminum, that has been debunked quite some time ago. Very little aluminum actually crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is that really nice barrier that keeps your brain healthy. Yeah. And so it's too large to go through, so very little gets into your brain. So we don't think that that is a cause of concern. Now, your earlier question about fluoride, it's similar to fillings and so oral health. So we do not today have any evidence that fluoride causes Alzheimer's, but I can tell you that there's been a lot of evidence more recently that poor oral hygiene actually can increase your risk. So it's important to actually have very good oral hygiene, right? And you can think about that in several ways. We're not quite sure, again, if it's the chicken and the egg. Is it the bacteria in the gums that are maybe getting into the brain? And there are some clinical trials that are actually looking at attacking that sort of gingivalis bacteria. Or is it that people with poor oral health have other conditions, have other things that are happening that are getting in the way of allowing them to make sure they have good oral hygiene? Bottom line is oral hygiene is really important.
So here's Niles France, myths about Alzheimer's, including the aluminum flu shots and dental fillings. So what about flu shots?
Yeah, flu shots are really interesting, and they have been studied quite a bit. And we'll have a lot of great information about vaccines and linked to dementia on alz.org at our annual Alzheimer's Association's International Conference this July. It's normally an international conference, and if COVID hadn't happened, we would have been in Amsterdam. But actually right now it is a conference that has gone virtual, and it is free of registration fee. So you can check out some of those stories on vaccines. And it's interesting because pneumonia vaccines, flu vaccines actually have a potential protective factor. And you can imagine that when you don't get those diseases, then your brain has a better outcome because it's not only healthier, but because the oxygen that, with pneumonia, with flu, that doesn't get to your brain in as efficient a method as it would usually, is causing problems for memory.
Here's Linda Griffin Thomas saying, thank you so much, Joan and Doctor, for this important information for all of us worried about or having experienced Alzheimer's in our family. I'm going to rewatch this presentation, maybe even a few times. Now, what you were just saying, though, about oxygen to the brain brings me to ask the question, so how important is exercise? Because when we exercise, it's oxygen and nutrients and everything that's going to your brain. it's creating, correct me if I'm wrong, neurogenesis. So isn't that the obvious next question?
So you're absolutely right. And that our lifestyle in general does contribute quite a bit to our healthy brain. And you can imagine, as we've talked about, these cardiovascular risk factors, they also interfere with a healthy vascular system. And the blood to the brain, and just like the rest of your body, is the way your brain gets all its nutrients. It's the way it takes out partially a lot of junk that shouldn't be in your brain. And so the better we can keep it oxygenated, and of course with proper vasculature, the better. So exercise is one of the key ways of getting that done. So nutrition, of course, is critical, and avoiding all these other risk factors is critical. But exercise has been shown to be important for memory.
So exercise and all that, oxygen goes to your brain, and you create this neurogenesis, but I forget what it's called. There's like something that's produced, like an offshoot when that neurogenesis occurs.
Right. And there's nerve growth factor that is released that actually stimulates nerves to grow.
And then at night when we sleep, if we're getting good sleep and enough sleep, it's almost kind of like that gets all washed away. Otherwise, you wake up with kind of like that foggy brain. So let's talk about how important sleep is in all of this.
So sleep is critical, and sleep is really important for memory overall. We've known this for 30 years, that during sleep, the brain actually is able to, I would say, consolidate all of the memories, all of the things that you experience during the day. And it also gets rid of the memories you don't really need. So the brain is very active when you sleep. We all know that from REM sleep and all of the conversations that we've had. And sleep is another very important factor, not only to a healthy life, but to memory itself. We have evidence that people with, for example, sleep apnea or other obstructive sleep disorders are actually at an increased risk for dementia and for Alzheimer's. So that is an important key factor. And we think that, of course, if you use a CPAP or if you maybe need one, you should be getting it, because oxygen to the brain is so critical when we sleep. And today we have some tools that can help us.
Terrific. Beth Juran, do you remember doing tests? Do you recommend doing testing like 23andMe to determine if you have the dementia gene?
Well, that's a really great question. And I think we talked earlier about genetics, and that if we have a first-degree relative with Alzheimer's, dementia, and diagnosis, then we know we are at an increased risk. So the gene we talked about, the ApoE4 gene, which is the one that confers the highest risk, is a gene that you can use 23andMe and other direct-to-consumer products to get tested for. So we have recommendations at alz.org if you are interested in doing that. And I'll just share with you that my own personal example. So we did not have that genetic testing for my husband or his siblings, and we've decided not to do that for various reasons. They are, of course, the recommendations of the Alzheimer's Association, but they include the fact that in the future, we just don't know if health insurance is going to be impacted by your knowledge of whether you have this gene. We do know that today there is a law called GINA that protects us from people or employers or health insurances using this information against us. But life insurance is not covered under that. And so I think, and long-term care insurance is not covered by that. So I think it's important for us to think through why you might want to have this decision or this knowledge. And also it's important to think about how it might impact your children if you have any, or your siblings, because your genetics are linked to theirs. So there's lots to unpack and think about. And again, alz.org will have information on genetic testing and on whether it's right for you.
Yeah, you really have a lot to think about to make. That's like a big decision. Joanne Agriasto says, are there supplements that can help brain health?
So that's a great question. We get that all the time. And ultimately, it's hard to determine whether supplements can actually replace the nutrients that we should be eating from food directly. And so ideally, we should always be getting these nutrients from food. There is, I would say, lower level evidence that, for example, DHA is helpful to the brain. There has been a trial that was done, but it was trending towards positive, but not positive in terms of what we would require in order to make recommendations. So DHA is something that has a lower level of, I think, evidence for it, for the brain. But I will tell you that because of all of these questions on risk, I'm really excited about the fact that one study in Finland did show that a combination of 4 things: the Nordic diet, because it's sweet, it's Finland, the exercise that they did 3 to 4 times a week that included cardio and strengthening, muscle strengthening. They included cardiovascular control of blood pressure and cholesterol, and included a cognitive exercise as well, that the combination of those 4 things actually enabled an older population over 65 that didn't have memory problems but were sedentary to have an increased memory and protected memory over the course of 2 years. So that's really impactful. That's the first study we've ever seen that has that. So what we did at the Alzheimer's Association is we decided to replicate that study in the United States, because we don't eat the Nordic diet here, and we know our diets are American diets. They're not as healthy as they should be. And we know that exercise is an important component. And we are actually going to do the cardiovascular health, and we recommend a blood pressure range below 120 or at 120, which I know is very difficult sometimes, but can be achieved, certainly with exercise and with antihypertensive medications, and also a cognitive engagement challenge. So we are combining those 4 things. We're going to do them in 2,000 persons around this country that are, again, we don't look like Finland. We are multicultural, so we are committed to that diversity. That way, we at the Alzheimer's Association are going to be able to give your audience a recipe for what the best thing to do for healthy aging looks like. Great. So that's what we're aiming. Give us about 3 years to finish the study, because we're now enrolling, and we have about 250 people enrolled already of the 2,000.
Well, you bring up cognitive exercise. So I have that. I mean, can we just reduce our risk of just cognitive loss by jigsaw puzzles or reading or learning new language and all those things that challenge our brain?
So I think that's, such an important question, because we do know that over time, some of our abilities can actually erode. It's like any muscle, right? And as we get older, our muscles will atrophy regardless, because we're getting older, right? We're getting wrinkles. It is with age, the aging process, and we're hopefully aging gracefully. But the important thing is that the brain is an organ that is impacted by aging just like every other. And so making sure you keep sharp, making sure you read, you test yourself, you quiz yourself, you socialize, because that's when we talk about current events and you recall them, right? I just heard this on the news. Here's what's happening. All these things are so important. And certainly if you want to deploy a game or something you find online to do that, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, can that protect you from a disease today that it can protect you from a disease? But can it keep your memory as possible so that we can withstand as much of the onslaught of not only aging, but of disease as possible? Then absolutely you should stay as sharp as possible as you age and exercise your brain just like you would every other muscle.
I want to talk about caregiving for people with Alzheimer's, but this is a good one. Sandy Stockdale says, what causes sundown syndrome? My mom, who suffered from dementia, she also suffered from sundown syndrome. What is that? As the sun starts to go down and the shadows change in the room.
Yeah, that's a very common thing that happens with people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia. And, around, certainly in the evening time, depending on where you are and what time that sun sets, it starts to really exacerbate symptoms and could actually also exacerbate some of the neuropsychiatric symptoms that if your loved one is affected by that too. It's unclear what causes it, but some of that has been thought to be attributed to the challenge that our loved ones experience when they are diagnosed with dementia with sleep, because they don't have regular sleep patterns. And so sometimes by that point, they've had lots of waking hours or challenges with sleep that they just act out. It's very similar to, perhaps how smaller children can act out when they are very tired. And so that time frame is just kind of that special hour where they've been up for a while and they're having those reactions to lack of sleep.
Well, here's another one. Patty Barber asked, why does someone with Alzheimer's keep their eyes closed even though they're not sleeping?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I don't really have an answer for that. I know that my mother-in-law did that as well. And I think that a part of that is just maybe that in their own mind, it's a lot easier not to have to look out into the community, into their surroundings. So one of the things that I kept in mind when I was with my mother-in-law was that imagine how you would feel if you were in a situation and you did not recognize your surroundings, even though it's your home, but you don't recognize the people around you either, and how anxious that might make you feel. And certainly when I know my mother-in-law had her eyes closed, she was at her calmest. And then that's okay. It's okay to understand and to know that they are anxious about not being able to recognize what's around them. And so I don't really have an answer, but I can just share with you that my mother-in-law did that too. And I thought that that's why, and left her alone, because if she was at peace, that's what was important to us.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit. I mean, we've been asking you all these questions about risks and symptoms and everything. And but I want to talk just for a moment about Alzheimer's kind of globally, because on one of the many interviews that you did that I watched on YouTube, getting ready for today, you said it's the most expensive disease in America. Talk to us a little bit about why that is.
Yeah, and I think, certainly having experienced it myself, I can tell you that those reasons became very personal, even though they're statistics that we use, right? But Alzheimer's dementia is the most expensive disease in the United States. It costs us over $300 billion a year, and most of that is care. And I wish I could tell you that we had some expensive treatments like some other diseases have. Unfortunately, our treatments are actually now almost generic. So it's not the treatment, it's the care. And that's really such an important part of this, because about 200 million of that is from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid and insurers. But there's a lot that goes from that goes into this care from families that put that in themselves out of pocket. And that is important. I know we did that ourselves. And we all chipped in to keep our loved one safe where we wanted to as a family. But it is a very expensive disease. And if we don't stop this trajectory now, by mid-century, that $300 billion will reach over $1 trillion. So it's imperative that we work on research now.
Yeah, because I mean, I read on your website, 50% of primary care physicians believe that the medical profession is not ready for this growing number of people with Alzheimer's and other dementias. I mean, this seems to me to be like the health crisis that's coming and the financial crisis that is going to really, I don't know what it would do to the U.S. economy. And we should point out, it's not just here in America. This problem is facing, we have populations in other countries, are some of them are growing their older population even faster than we are. But it's going to be
absolutely correct.
Yeah, it's going to be the finances that's going to just, I mean, it could bring us to our knees.
We make this very, very apparent to our federal government and our state governments, because we want more support from the government to not only find better treatments, but to help us provide more education about caring for someone in their home, because so many people are affected. And our baby boomers are about halfway through that age of 65 and over, where it puts them at the most increased risk. So it's really important to get that information out there. But we're really pleased that the federal government has responded. The Alzheimer's Association and its sister organization, the Alzheimer's Impact Movement, have been able to increase funding in the past 6 years from $450 million a year, that's it, $450 million, to almost $3 billion today. And heart disease has about 5, cancer has about 6 billion a year. Wow. So we see that funding research does get us results. And it's time to emphasize brain health and Alzheimer's now.
Yeah, because, all of these other massive amounts of funding, and they're all fantastic, and they're all letting us
Fantastic.
live longer and longer. But if we don't crack this nut,
Right.
this is the one. I mean, you only want to live longer and longer if you've got somewhat kind of quality of life. So
That's exactly right.
This is really the one that is going to be the imperative going into the future.
As you said, we've done such a great job with these other diseases from the neck down. Now it's time to focus on the brain, because we do want to live into those golden years, but we want to be there with a high quality of life.
Here's Donald Mason. Wish I could have been paid for caring. Lost a job and cared for him by myself to the last week of his life. But no, I am forever blessed for doing this and wish he was still here. There's a lot of people that are part of my Facebook audience that are dealing with caregiving for someone with Alzheimer's or dementia. And you know that I'm a very outspoken advocate in this field of senior care and senior health. Just explain a little bit to us what one deals with. Like, what is it like to be a caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I can certainly get into that and start with the fact that there are over 15 million caregivers of someone with Alzheimer's in this country today. And so there are millions of people that are caring for their loved ones in various ways. Some are remote caring because they live in different cities. Some are in the same city, and some are in the same household. But it is such a challenge. And I can tell you that not only is it a financial burden, but it's hard to see your loved one over time start to not recognize you or your family, their grandchildren, for example. I think that was one of the hardest things for us, was when my children's grandmother stopped recognizing them. Hardest thing for my husband, when my mother-in-law did not recognize him, but knew that she knew him. But I think one of the hardest things is really the nighttime. I did not understand this until we cared ourselves for my mother-in-law, but she had issues with sleep, and she could not sleep at night, and she would wander. So we had to have 24-hour support, 24-hour care. That's really where that biggest burden comes from, that 24-hour care, to make sure she stayed safe. But it's exhausting. So we would take turns on weekends, and you were up all night, and then you go back to your family, and we're the sandwich generation. So you also have to care for your kids, you have to be with your family, but you're exhausted. I mean, these are things that people don't think about until they actually experience them. But caregivers are heroes. And we would have not done anything differently, just as your audience wouldn't.
We have a few people that are some of those heroes. Gail Hendricks, my mother, and 7 others passed away from Alzheimer's disease. I was my mother's caregiver. It was very hard. I'm now watching my sister with this debilitating disease. I'm 74, and thank goodness I have no signs at this point. We have Carol Shapiro, who I know very well. We are related by our children's marriage, and she's the one who brought me to you today. She, of course, dealt with early onset Alzheimer's with her husband, who lived many more years than they thought. Advocacy, she says, is vitally important for teaching the general public and also for our elected officials. I think that's also why we need more female elected officials.
Here.
Sorry.
But Carol's absolutely right, and thank you to Carol for being a champion. But advocacy is what has gotten us increased funding at the federal level, that we're still asking for more, by the way. We're requesting another $354 million this year from Congress, so we'll hope that we get that. But it's so important, to recognize education, that caregiving, that so many things are critical, and at the state level. So state legislators have to understand this as well. So, and we're working very closely with the CDC to see how that we can work with public health offices around the country, which I know right now are focused on COVID, but COVID won't be with us always, and Alzheimer's will continue. So it's important to think about how we work there. And again, alz.org has a whole advocacy section, so that hopefully maybe you might just want to sign up to get alerts about how you can get in touch with your congressman or woman and ask them to support Alzheimer's.
And we're putting up the website and even a phone number as we go. Here's Linda Griffin Thomas. She says, I wanted to care for my mom at our home, but her neurologist said unless we could have someone awake 24/7, it was not safe for her to be in our house long term. It's really a horrible disease. Now, I had the same thing happen. My mom suffered from dementia. She also had a few strokes in the frontal portion of the brain, so her balance was off and she would fall. And my neurologist said the same, and the neurosurgeon, that I needed to have her somewhere where she would be watched 24/7. And I fortunately found a wonderful small care facility where she had a thing on the ground that every time she touched her foot on it, an alarm would go off. They put a blow-up mattress next to her bed at night so that if she tried to get out of bed, that it would her fall. And I bless them every day of my life that they kept her safe. And she lived till almost 95. And suffered from dementia. What here, it says Diane Tika, Ticha. What is the best organization to fundraise for or donate to?
Well, I mean, I have to tell you that I'm very proud of the Alzheimer's Association's work because we are a full service organization. We work on research because that's critical, and I am in charge of the research division. And we currently are funding over $160 million in active projects around the world, about 550 research projects right now active. But we also do advocacy. And we are the reason why we have increased dollars at the federal level for research. But we also know that it's so important to create programs, support groups, and support caregivers. So that's what we do as well. So we have all of this across the country in our chapter offices, so that there's an office probably near you. And at alzorg.org, you can find who is the closest to you. We also have a 24-hour helpline that I know you're going to put up. But that 800-272-3900 number is that's critical. Emergency situations. I can't get my loved one into the shower, into the bath. What can I do? We have support 24 hours a day with social workers that are ready to help you every single day of the week. So that's why I'm so proud of the Alzheimer's Association. I continue to work here even after 15 years.
And as well you should be, and it's a good place for us to end. Niles, there in your office, has that helpline up. If everyone wants to jot it down, to all the heroes out there who are taking care of loved ones, whether it's in your home or those in senior care facilities, we salute you. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Doctor, thank you so much. This has been such incredibly great information today. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joan, for highlighting such an important issue for our aging audiences, but for all of us that have been affected. Thank you so much.
Yeah, namaste. All right, everyone. As I say every day, namaste. Let's, this is part of the reason why I felt that, I wanted to write my book, is because when you start feeling these little things that come about, you freak out. Let's just say it like that. You kind of freak out a little bit and you want to know. Like I said, I had a book agent, may he rest in peace, that said you will always write about that which you want to know more about. So let's make sure to take care of ourselves. So much good information today. So everybody get out, exercise. You heard it just there from the doctor. Let's be careful that we're eating as many good foods as we can so we get the nutrients from the foods, but of course we can always supplement. Make sure that you take advantage of the National Alzheimer's Association if you are caring for a loved one and you need any kind of support or advice. All right, everyone, it's Tuesday. I'll see you back here tomorrow. We are talking with Dr. Mike Dow, who wrote The Sugar Brain Fix. And on Thursday, Dr. Daniel Amen. I mean, he's just, one of the most important, our most sought after and recognized psychiatrist in America, studying the brain, a leading expert in brain imaging. I have a slew of his books. So I will see you back here tomorrow. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.